The stagecoach rattled into Clifton, Arizona territory, on a scorching afternoon in June 1882, carrying a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, and Katherine Daniels pressed her gloved hand against the worn leather seat to steady herself as the wheels bounced over the rutted Main Street. She had answered an advertisement in the Boston Herald 3 months prior, exchanged exactly 7 letters with a rancher named Robert Crawford, and now found herself squinting through the dusty window at a frontier town that looked nothing like the genteel Massachusetts streets she had left behind. The buildings were mostly wood and adobe, paint peeling where paint existed at all, and the few women she glimpsed wore practical calico rather than the elaborate bustles that had been fashionable back east. Katherine smoothed down her own traveling dress, suddenly aware that the dark blue silk was far too fine for this place, marking her as an outsider as clearly as if she wore a sign. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside what appeared to be a general store, and the driver called down in a voice roughened by trail dust. She gathered her reticule, took a breath that tasted of heat and sage, and accepted the driver's hand as she stepped down onto soil that seemed to radiate warmth through the soles of her boots. A small crowd had gathered, the way they did in small towns when the stage arrived, faces curious and evaluating. Katherine felt their eyes on her and lifted her chin, refusing to show the fear that had been building in her chest for the past 500 miles. "Miss Daniels." The voice came from behind her, deep and careful, and Katherine turned to find a man removing his hat with work-roughened hands. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. His face was sun-weathered and honest, with strong features that might have been handsome if not for the obvious nervousness that tightened his jaw. This was Robert Crawford, the man whose letters had been polite and thoughtful, describing his ranch and his hopes with a surprising eloquence that had made Katherine believe she might find something approaching happiness in this distant territory. "Mr. Crawford," she said, proud that her voice remained steady, "I am pleased to finally meet you." He studied her for a moment, those river-colored eyes taking in her face with an intensity that made heat rise to her cheeks. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Daniels. I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was long," Katherine admitted, "but I am here now, and that is what matters." Robert nodded, still holding his hat, still looking at her as if she might vanish if he blinked. The crowd was dispersing, disappointed that there would be no immediate drama, but Katherine felt the weight of their future gossip in every glance. A mail-order bride was always a subject of speculation. "I have rooms arranged for you at the boarding house," Robert said, gesturing toward a 2-story structure down the street. "Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable establishment. I thought you might want a few days to settle before we proceed with the wedding, unless you would prefer to wait longer." Katherine appreciated his consideration, though part of her wanted to simply get on with it, to cross this threshold and begin whatever life awaited her on the other side. "A few days would be welcome," she said. "I confess I am rather weary from the journey." "Of course." Robert replaced his hat and reached for her trunk, which the driver had deposited in the dust. "I will carry this for you. Please, this way." As they walked down the street, Katherine became acutely aware of the differences between them. Robert moved with the easy confidence of a man who belonged to this land, his stride long and unhurried, while she picked her way carefully, trying to avoid the worst of the dust and the suspicious dark stains that marked the wooden sidewalk. He did not try to fill the silence with empty conversation, and she found herself grateful for that small mercy. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a formidable woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She showed Katherine to a small but clean room on the second floor, with a window that overlooked the street and a bed that looked blessedly comfortable after weeks of traveling. "Mr. Crawford has already settled your account for the week, Mrs. Patterson said, setting a pitcher of water on the washstand. "Supper is at 6. We keep a quiet house here." When the landlady had departed, Katherine sank onto the bed and allowed herself a moment of pure exhaustion. She had done it. She had actually left everything she knew and traveled across a continent to marry a stranger. The enormity of the decision settled over her like a weight, and for a brief moment she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But no, there had been nothing left for her in Boston. Her parents were 5 years dead, victims of the influenza that had swept through the city. Her uncle, who had taken her in, had made it clear that she was a burden he could not afford to keep. Marriage to one of the men in her social circle would have been impossible even if she had wanted it, because her family had lost everything when her father's business partner had absconded with their savings. She had been facing the prospect of working as a seamstress or companion, living in someone else's house, dependent on someone else's charity. At least here, as Robert Crawford's wife, she would have a home of her own. Katherine unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe and arranging her hairbrush and pins on the small dresser. Through the window, she could see the street below, a cowboy riding past on a paint horse, a woman carrying a basket, the ordinary business of a frontier town. In the distance, mountains rose against an impossibly blue sky, so different from the gentle hills of New England that they seemed like something from a storybook. That evening at supper, Katherine met the other boarders, a schoolteacher named Miss Ellis, a bank clerk called Mr. Thompson, and an older gentleman who introduced himself as Judge Winters. They were polite but curious, asking careful questions about her journey and her plans. Katherine answered as best she could, aware that her future in this town depended in part on making a good impression with these people. "Robert Crawford is a good man," Judge Winters said, cutting into his beefsteak with the air of someone pronouncing an official verdict. "Built his ranch from nothing, fair in his dealings. You could do worse, young lady." "I am sure I could," Katherine said, though she wondered how the judge could be so certain. She knew almost nothing about Robert beyond what he had written in his letters, and letters could lie. The next morning, Robert called on her at 10 o'clock, properly announced by Mrs. Patterson, and they sat in the boarding-house parlor while the landlady pretended not to listen from the next room. He had brought a small bouquet of wildflowers, which he presented with the same nervous formality he had shown at the stage-coach. "I thought you might like to see the town," he said, "if you are feeling rested enough." Katherine accepted the flowers, touched by the gesture. "That would be very nice, thank you." They walked through Clifton together, Robert pointing out the various establishments. The general store run by the Morrison family, the church where Reverend Blake held services every Sunday, the saloon that Robert passed without comment, the small schoolhouse where Miss Ellis taught. The town was larger than Katherine had expected, serving the surrounding ranches and the mining operations in the nearby hills. Robert explained that copper had been discovered in the area a few years back, bringing an influx of miners and the businesses that served them. "The ranch is about 5 miles north of here," Robert said as they paused near the edge of town, looking out toward rolling hills covered in grass and scattered juniper. "It is not fancy, but it is good land. I run about 200 head of cattle, and I have been building the herd steadily. There is a house, a barn, corrals, a good well." "It sounds fine," Katherine said, trying to imagine herself in such a place. Robert turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Miss Daniels, I want to be honest with you. Ranch life is hard work. It is not like living in a city. There will be times when I am gone from dawn to dusk, checking the stock or mending fences. There will be dust and heat and isolation. If you are having second thoughts, I would rather know now than after we are married." Katherine met his gaze directly. "Mr. Crawford, I did not come all this way on a whim. I understand that life here will be different from what I knew in Boston. I am prepared to work hard and make the best of whatever circumstances I find. What I ask in return is honesty and fair treatment. If you can promise me that, then I have no second thoughts." Something shifted in Robert's expression, a tension easing from around his eyes. "I can promise you that," he said. "I will always be honest with you, and I will treat you with the respect you deserve." They returned to the boarding house in a more comfortable silence than before, and when Robert left, he pressed her hand briefly, a gesture that felt like a promise. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church, with Judge Winters and Mrs. Patterson serving as witnesses. Katherine wore her best dress, a dove-gray silk that her mother had made for her years ago, and Robert wore a dark suit that looked stiff and uncomfortable on his rancher's frame. Reverend Blake conducted the ceremony with simple dignity, and when Robert slipped a gold band onto Katherine's finger, she felt the weight of it like a shackle and a lifeline all at once. They held a small reception at the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson having prepared a cake and coffee for the occasion. A few of the townspeople stopped by to offer their congratulations. The Morrisons from the general store, Miss Ellis, Judge Winters, and several ranchers who were Robert's neighbors and friends. Katherine smiled and accepted their good wishes, acutely aware that she was now Mrs. Robert Crawford, tied to this place, and this man by bonds both legal and social. When the sun began to lower toward the mountains, Robert brought his wagon around to collect her belongings. Katherine said goodbye to Mrs. Patterson, who surprised her by clasping her hand warmly and telling her she was welcome to visit any time she needed another woman to talk to. Then Katherine climbed up onto the wagon seat, arranging her skirts, and they set off toward the ranch that was now her home. The road north was rough, cutting through grassland where cattle grazed in the distance. Robert handled the team with easy competence, not pushing them but keeping them moving at a steady pace. The sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, and Katherine had to admit there was a certain stark beauty to this country. "I should tell you something," Robert said, breaking the silence that had stretched for the better part of a mile. "About the storms." Katherine looked at him, surprised by the abrupt statement. "Storms? We get thunderstorms here, especially this time of year. They come up fast from the south, bringing lightning and rain, sometimes hail. They can be fierce." "I see," Katherine said, though she did not see what this had to do with anything. Then, because honesty seemed to be the foundation they were building on, she added, "I confess I have always been frightened of thunder. It is foolish, I know, but ever since I was a child, the sound has terrified me." Robert glanced at her, and something in his expression softened. "That is not foolish," he said. "Thunder is the sound of something powerful beyond our control. It makes sense to be wary of it." The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a collection of buildings clustered near a line of cottonwoods that marked a creek. The house was adobe with a wooden porch, single-story and practical. The barn was larger, and Katherine could see several horses in the corral. It was isolated and spare, but it looked solid and real in a way that made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not quite name. Robert helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk into the house. Inside, the main room held a table, chairs, a stove for cooking, and a few other simple furnishings. Everything was clean but plainly masculine, lacking any of the small touches that made a house feel like a home. There were 2 other rooms. a bedroom with a large bed covered in a quilt, and a smaller room that Robert said he had been using for storage but could be converted to whatever purpose she wished. "I know it is not much," Robert said, standing in the middle of the main room with his hat in his hands again, that nervous gesture that Katherine was beginning to recognize. "But you can arrange things however you like. Change whatever you want." Katherine set down her reticule and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "It is a good house," she said. "Solid. I can work with this." That night they were awkward with each other, two strangers bound by law but not yet by any deeper understanding. Robert was respectful to the point of formality, asking permission before entering the bedroom, giving Katherine space to change into her nightgown in privacy. When they finally lay down together in the darkness, he kept a careful distance between them. "Katherine," he said into the quiet, using her given name for the first time, "I want you to know that I will not press you for anything you are not ready to give. We can take our time getting to know each other." She turned toward him, though she could barely see his outline in the dark. "That is kind of you, Robert. I appreciate it." They fell asleep on opposite sides of the bed, and Katherine's last conscious thought was that she had made her choice and now had to live with it, for better or worse. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Robert rose before dawn to tend the stock, and Katherine woke to the smell of coffee that he left warming on the stove before he went out. She spent the mornings cleaning and organizing the house, making it more livable, adding small touches from the few decorative items she had brought with her. In the afternoons, she worked on mending Robert's clothes, which were numerous and much in need of repair, or prepared supper from the provisions in the pantry. Robert came in at dusk, washed up on the porch, and they ate together at the table, making careful conversation about the day's events. He was, Katherine discovered, a man of few words but much thoughtfulness. He noticed when she rearranged the kitchen and thanked her for making it more efficient. He brought her fresh eggs from the henhouse she had not known existed behind the barn. He asked her opinion on matters relating to the house and seemed to genuinely listen to her answers. Slowly, carefully, they were learning each other. On the 8th day of their marriage, Katherine woke to a strange heaviness in the air. The sky had an odd yellow cast, and the birds that usually sang in the cottonwoods were silent. Robert noticed it too when he came in for the noon meal. "Storm coming," he said, looking toward the south where dark clouds were building on the horizon. "A big one, I think. I need to get the stock secured and make sure everything is battened down. You should stay in the house." Katherine nodded, feeling the first flutter of fear in her chest. The clouds were advancing quickly, towering thunderheads that seemed to reach the top of the sky. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up, hot and restless, carrying the smell of rain and dust. Robert worked steadily, moving the horses into the barn, checking the shutters on the windows, bringing in firewood from the pile outside. The first rumble of thunder came just as he finished, a low growl that seemed to roll across the earth. Katherine flinched despite herself, and Robert saw it. "It will be all right," he said, closing the door against the rising wind. "The house is solid. We will be safe." But as the storm moved over them, Katherine found that rational knowledge did nothing to calm her fear. The thunder grew louder, crashing directly overhead, and with it came lightning that lit up the room in stark flashes of white. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the corners of the house. Katherine tried to continue with her sewing, to act as if nothing was wrong, but her hands were shaking so badly that she could not thread the needle. Another tremendous crack of thunder seemed to shake the very walls, and Katherine could not help the small cry that escaped her. She dropped the sewing and pressed her hands over her ears, hating herself for the weakness, but unable to control the panic that was rising in her chest. Then Robert was there, kneeling beside her chair. "Katherine," he said gently, "it is all right. You are safe." "I am sorry," she said, her voice tight with the effort of not crying. "I know it is foolish. I know there is nothing to fear, but I cannot help it." "Come here," Robert said, and he took her hand and led her to the sofa that sat against one wall. He sat down and pulled her down beside him, then wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "You are not foolish. Fear does not have to be rational to be real." Katherine let herself lean into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. When the next thunder came, she pressed her face against his shoulder and Robert's arm tightened around her. "I have you," he said quietly. "The storm will pass. They always do. Just breathe." They sat like that as the storm raged outside, Robert holding Katherine close, murmuring occasional reassurances, his presence a steady anchor against her fear. Gradually, Katherine's panic began to subside. She focused on the things she could control. Her breathing, the feeling of Robert's hand rubbing slow circles on her arm, the solid reality of the house around them. The storm continued for another hour, but it had lost its power to terrify her because she was not facing it alone. When the thunder finally rumbled away into the distance and the rain gentled to a steady patter, Katherine realized she was still pressed against Robert's side, his arm still around her. She should move, she thought. It was not proper, even though they were married, but she did not want to move. For the first time since arriving in Arizona territory, she felt safe. "Thank you," she said softly, not pulling away, "for not making me feel ashamed." "There is nothing to be ashamed of," Robert said. His voice rumbled in his chest and Katherine could feel the vibration of it. "We all have our fears. The measure of a person is not in being fearless, but in facing the fear anyway." Katherine tilted her head to look up at him and found him already looking down at her. In the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked windows, his eyes were very green, very kind. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, a possibility. Almost without thinking, Katherine raised her hand to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Robert went very still, his gaze searching hers. "Katherine," he said, and there was a question in his voice. In answer, she leaned up and kissed him, a tentative brush of lips that sent warmth cascading through her entire body. Robert made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss, his hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. Katherine had been kissed before, chased stolen moments with beaux back in Boston, but nothing had prepared her for this, for the way her whole body seemed to wake up and take notice. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Robert rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the moment you stepped off that stage coach," he admitted. "Then why did you not?" Katherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted you to want it too," Robert said. "I did not want you to feel obligated." Katherine kissed him again, longer this time with more confidence. When she pulled back, she said, "I do want it, I want you." That night, they came together as husband and wife in truth, and Katherine discovered that the physical act of love could be tender and passionate all at once, that Robert's careful strength translated into a consideration that made her feel cherished rather than used. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, listening to the last of the rain dripping from the eaves, Katherine felt something shift in her heart. This was not the marriage she had imagined when she was a girl dreaming in Boston, but it might be something better, something real. The summer progressed, hot and dry except for the occasional storms that rolled in from the south. Each time thunder rumbled in the distance, Robert would find Katherine and hold her, sometimes sitting together on the porch to watch the lightning dance across the sky, sometimes in the house if the storm was particularly fierce. Catherine's fear never entirely disappeared, but it became manageable, contained, because she knew Robert would be there. Their marriage deepened in other ways too. Robert taught Katherine to ride, putting her on a gentle mare named Sweetpea and walking beside her until she found her balance. Katherine discovered she enjoyed the freedom of it, the way the world opened up when you were not confined to a house or a wagon. They rode together in the evenings sometimes, checking on the cattle, watching the sun set over the mountains. Katherine learned the rhythms of ranch life. The constant work of maintaining fences and buildings, the cycle of the seasons that dictated when calves were born and when cattle were driven to market, the isolation that could be both peaceful and lonely. She made bread and churned butter and tended a vegetable garden that she coaxed into life with careful watering. She learned which plants could survive the heat and which would wither no matter how much she cared for them. In August, Robert hired 2 men to help with the roundup, cowboys named Jimmy and Pete who were polite and hardworking. Katherine cooked for them, large hearty meals that the men wolfed down with enthusiastic appreciation. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, and sometimes Jimmy would pull out a harmonica and play mournful tunes while the stars came out overhead. It was Pete who warned them about the raiders. He had heard in town that a group of men had been hitting isolated ranches to the south, stealing cattle and horses, sometimes burning buildings. "You are pretty far out here," Pete said, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "Might want to keep a closer watch." Robert increased his vigilance, and he taught Katherine to shoot, putting the rifle in her hands and showing her how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. Katherine proved to be a decent shot, though she prayed she would never have to use the skill in earnest. The raiders never came to the Crawford ranch, though they heard stories of other places that were not so lucky. The territorial sheriff increased his patrols, and eventually word came that the gang had been caught trying to cross into Mexico. Life settled back into its steady rhythm. Autumn brought cooler temperatures and the hard work of preparing for winter. They slaughtered hogs and smoked the meat, stored root vegetables in the cellar, made sure there was enough hay put by for the stock. Robert hired a carpenter to help him add a room onto the house, expanding the kitchen and creating a proper pantry. Katherine hung curtains she had sewn from fabric ordered from the general store catalog, adding touches of color to the adobe walls. In October, Katherine realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week to be certain, then told Robert one evening as they sat at the table after supper. "I believe I am with child," she said, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and fear. Robert stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then slowly a smile spread across his features, transforming him. "Truly," he asked, his voice rough with emotion, "I believe so. It is early yet, but the signs are there." Robert stood and came around the table, pulling Katherine to her feet and into his arms. He held her carefully as if she might break, and Katherine felt his lips press against her hair. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." The pregnancy progressed through the winter months. Katherine felt tired and queasy at first, struggling with the smell of cooking meat, but by the new year she felt better, and her body began to change in obvious ways. Robert treated her like spun glass, trying to do all the heavy work himself, but Katherine insisted on continuing her usual tasks. She felt strong and capable, more alive than she had ever felt in her life. They had their first real argument in February, when Katherine insisted on helping Robert bring in firewood during a cold snap, and he insisted she stay inside where it was warm. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," Katherine said, her voice sharp with frustration. "I can carry a few pieces of wood." "The ground is icy. What if you fall? What if something happens to the baby?" Robert's face was tight with worry. "Nothing will happen. I am being careful." "But I cannot spend the next 4 months sitting idle while you work yourself to exhaustion." They stood facing each other in the yard, breath pluming in the cold air, neither willing to back down. Finally, Robert sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I am frightened," he admitted. "I have already grown to love this child, and I could not bear it if anything went wrong." Catherine's anger melted away. She stepped close and took his hands. "I am frightened too," she said. "But we cannot live in fear. We have to trust that everything will be all right." They compromised, Katherine doing lighter tasks while Robert handled the heaviest work, both of them learning to navigate this new phase of their life together. Spring arrived with a profusion of wildflowers and the birth of new calves. Catherine's belly swelled until she could no longer see her feet, and her back ached from the weight she carried. Robert brought a midwife out from town, a capable woman named Mrs. Hennessy, who examined Katherine and pronounced her healthy and strong. The baby came on a night in late May, arriving in a storm of pain and effort that Katherine endured with Robert holding her hand and Mrs. Hennessy offering calm encouragement. When it was over, when the baby's first cry split the air, Katherine collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and triumphant. "A boy," Mrs. Hennessy announced, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket. "A fine, healthy boy." She placed the infant in Catherine's arms, and Katherine looked down at the tiny red face, the dark hair, the perfect miniature fingers that were already grasping at the air. Love swept through her with such force that it took her breath away. Robert knelt beside the bed, his eyes wet with tears he made no attempt to hide. "He is beautiful," he said hoarsely. "You are both beautiful." They named him Matthew, and he proved to have healthy lungs that he exercised frequently, especially at night. Katherine walked the floor with him, singing lullabies her own mother had sung to her, while Robert stood swaying on his feet after a full day's work, trying to help. They were exhausted and overwhelmed and completely in love with their son. The summer Matthew turned 1, a drought struck the territory. The creek that ran through the Crawford property began to run low, and the grass turned brown and brittle. Robert worried constantly about the cattle, about having enough water and feed to keep them alive. Other ranchers were selling off their stock at a loss, but Robert was determined to hold on if he could. Katherine watched him grow gaunt with worry, saw the way he would stand on the porch in the evenings, staring at the cloudless sky as if he could will rain into existence. She brought him coffee and stood beside him, her hand on his arm, offering what comfort she could. "We will get through this," she said. "Whatever happens, we will manage." "I do not want to lose everything I have built," Robert said, his voice raw. "I want to give you and Matthew a good life." "You already have," Katherine said firmly. "The ranch is just land and cattle. What matters is us, our family. As long as we have each other, we have everything that truly counts." Robert pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "How did I get so lucky?" he asked. "A woman who travels 2,000 miles to marry a stranger and ends up being the strongest person I know." The drought broke in August with a series of violent thunderstorms that dumped inches of rain on the parched earth. Katherine sat with Matthew in her lap, Robert's arm around them both, and watched the lightning fork across the sky. She still felt the flutter of fear in her stomach when the thunder crashed, but it was distant now, manageable. Robert's presence had become such a constant source of comfort that even her oldest fears had lost their sharpest edges. Matthew grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. He followed Robert around the ranch like a shadow, chattering in his half-formed words, trying to help with tasks far beyond his ability. Robert was endlessly patient with him, explaining the work, letting Matthew hold the hammer or carry the bucket, even when it would have been faster to do it alone. When Matthew was 3, Katherine realized she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with joy untinged by fear, though Robert still worried and fussed over her. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1886, a calm baby with blue eyes and a sweet disposition. They named her Sarah, and Matthew was fascinated by his little sister, always wanting to hold her and show her his treasures. The ranch prospered. Robert had weathered the drought and built his reputation as a fair dealer and hard worker. He expanded the herd and hired a full-time ranch hand, a young man named Tom who lived in a small cabin near the barn. The house was filled with the noise of children, with laughter and occasional tears, with the messy, beautiful chaos of family life. Katherine had never imagined herself as a rancher's wife, but she had grown into the role, becoming strong and capable in ways she never could have been in Boston. She could shoot straight, ride well, tend sick animals, and deliver a calf if necessary. She had also become a pillar of the small community around Clifton, helping organize church socials and teaching other women to read and write. The storms still came, rolling in with their thunder and lightning, and Robert still held Katherine through every one. It had become a ritual between them, a way of honoring where they had started and how far they had come. Sometimes the children would join them, snuggling into the safety of their parents' embrace, learning that fear was nothing to be ashamed of, and that love was always stronger. One evening in the summer of 1888, when Matthew was 5 and Sarah was 2, Katherine and Robert sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The children were asleep inside, worn out from a day of play. The air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of sage and grass. "Do you ever regret it?" Robert asked suddenly. "Leaving Boston, coming out here, marrying me?" Katherine looked at him in surprise. "Never," she said. "Why would you ask such a thing?" Robert shrugged, his eyes on the distant mountains. "You gave up everything you knew. Sometimes I wonder if you would have been happier with an easier life." Katherine took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I gave up nothing that mattered," she said, "and I gained everything. A home, a family, a partner who holds me through storms. What more could I possibly want?" Robert turned to her, his eyes searching her face in the fading light. "I love you," he said. "I do not think I have told you that enough, but it is true. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," Katherine said, feeling the truth of it settle in her bones. "You were a stranger when I stepped off that stagecoach, but you have become the center of my world." They kissed as the last light left the sky, a kiss that tasted of coffee and contentment, of years shared and years still to come. A storm rolled in overnight, and Katherine woke to the sound of thunder rumbling across the sky. She felt the familiar flutter of unease, but before it could grow, Robert's arm tightened around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "I have you," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Go back to sleep. You are safe," and she was. She was safe and loved and home, in a place she never could have imagined, with a man who had proven himself worthy of her trust 1,000 times over. Katherine closed her eyes and let the sound of the storm fade into background noise, no more frightening than the wind or the rain. Robert's steady breathing lulled her back toward sleep, and her last conscious thought was gratitude for the advertisement she had answered, for the courage that had brought her west, for every choice that had led to this moment. The years continued to unfold, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Matthew started school in town, riding in each morning with his father and riding back in the afternoon, full of stories about his lessons and his friends. Sarah grew from a calm baby into a spirited little girl who loved horses and had no fear of anything. Katherine sometimes wondered where that fearlessness came from, since both she and Robert had their anxieties, but she was grateful for it nonetheless. In 1890, Katherine gave birth to twin boys, a surprise that left both parents reeling. Thomas and James were identical, with dark hair and mischievous smiles, and they kept Katherine running from morning to night. Robert hired additional help, both for the ranch and for the house, bringing in a young woman named Clara to assist Katherine with the cooking and cleaning and child-minding. The house seemed to burst at the seams with children and noise and life. Robert built an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and expanding the main room, transforming the modest ranch house into something more substantial. Katherine planted roses by the porch and hung more curtains and filled the shelves with books ordered from catalogs. The place began to feel not just like a house, but like a true home, shaped by the family that lived within its walls. Matthew proved to have his father's affinity for ranch work, spending every spare moment helping with the cattle and horses. Sarah showed an unexpected talent for drawing, covering sheets of paper with surprisingly accurate sketches of animals and landscapes. The twins were still too young to show their inclinations, though they seemed primarily interested in getting into mischief. Through it all, Katherine and Robert's partnership deepened. They had learned to work together, to anticipate each other's needs, to communicate without words when necessary. They still had disagreements, still faced challenges and setbacks, but they faced them together, united by the bonds they had forged. One afternoon in the spring of 1892, Katherine was working in the garden when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Visitors were not uncommon, but something about the urgency of the horse's pace made her straighten and shade her eyes against the sun. It was Tom, the ranch hand, driving faster than was safe on the rough track. "Mrs. Crawford," he called as soon as he was within shouting distance. "There has been an accident. Mr. Crawford took a fall from his horse. Doc is with him now." Katherine's heart seemed to stop. She dropped her trowel and ran toward the wagon, her skirts catching on the plants she had been tending. "How bad is it?" she demanded as Tom pulled the horses to a halt. "I do not rightly know, madam. He was conscious when I left to fetch you, but he hit his head pretty hard." Katherine shouted for Clara to watch the children, then climbed up onto the wagon seat, and Tom turned the team back the way he had come. The ride to the north pasture seemed to take an eternity, every bump and jolt sending Katherine's fear higher. Robert had to be all right. He had to be. She could not imagine her life without him, could not conceive of facing the world alone again. They found Robert lying in the shade of a juniper tree, the town doctor kneeling beside him. Robert's face was pale beneath the dust and blood, and there was a gash on his forehead that was still bleeding despite the bandage someone had pressed against it. But his eyes were open, and when he saw Katherine, he tried to smile. "It is not as bad as it looks," he said, his voice strained. "The damn horse spooked at a snake and threw me. I hit a rock on the way down." The doctor, a capable man named Peterson, looked up at Katherine. "He has a concussion, possibly a cracked rib or two. I want to watch him for the next few days to make sure there is no bleeding in his brain, but I think he will be fine with rest." Katherine knelt beside Robert and took his hand, gripping it hard enough that her knuckles went white. "You frightened me," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to control it. "I am sorry," Robert said. He raised his other hand to touch her face, his fingers gentle despite the pain he must be feeling. "I am all right, Katherine, I promise." They got Robert back to the house and into bed, where he proceeded to chafe at the forced inactivity. The doctor's orders were strict. Complete bed rest for at least a week, no getting up except for necessary purposes, no work of any kind. Robert protested, worried about the ranch, about all the tasks that needed doing, but Katherine was firm. "Tom and the other hands can manage for a week," she said. "Your job is to heal. If you do not follow the doctor's orders, you will only make things worse and be laid up even longer." Grumbling, Robert obeyed, though he was a terrible patient. Katherine brought him meals in bed and sat with him in the afternoons, reading aloud from the newspapers or books while he dozed. The children were allowed brief visits, climbing carefully onto the bed to show their father drawings or tell him stories about their day. On the third night, a storm rolled in, one of the fierce spring thunderstorms that could shake the foundations of the house. Katherine was sitting beside the bed, mending by lamplight, when the first rumble of thunder sounded. She felt the old familiar fear rise up, stronger than it had been in years, perhaps because Robert was hurt and vulnerable and could not hold her the way he usually did. The thunder grew louder, closer, and Katherine's hands began to shake. She set down her mending and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to breathe through the panic. "Katherine," Robert's voice cut through her fear. "Come here." She looked at him, at his pale face and the bandage on his head, and shook her head. "You need to rest. I am fine." "You are not fine, and I need you here. Please." Katherine crossed to the bed and sat carefully on the edge, trying not to jostle him. Robert reached for her hand and pulled her down beside him, arranging her so that her head rested on his shoulder, his arm around her. "There," he said softly. "That is better." Another crack of thunder shook the house, and Katherine flinched. Robert's arm tightened around her. "I have you," he said, the same words he had spoken so many times over the years. "You are safe. We are both safe." Katherine closed her eyes and focused on Robert's heartbeat, steady beneath her ear. Even injured and weak, he was trying to comfort her, trying to hold her through the storm. She thought about how far they had come, how this man who had been a stranger had become her anchor, her home, the person she trusted above all others. "I love you," she whispered. "If something had happened to you, if I had lost you, I do not know what I would have done." "You would have survived," Robert said. "You are the strongest person I know, Katherine Crawford. You would have grieved, and then you would have gotten up and taken care of our children and run this ranch and built a good life. But you do not have to worry about that, because I am not going anywhere. I intend to grow old with you, to watch our children grow up and have children of their own, to sit on that porch in our rocking chairs and argue about whose memory is failing faster." Despite her fear, Katherine smiled. "That sounds nice," she said. "It does not it?" Robert pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Now listen to the storm with me. It is just sound and light, Katherine. It cannot hurt us here." They lay together as the storm raged outside, and Katherine found that her fear was manageable as long as Robert held her. Eventually, the thunder moved on. The rain gentled, and Katherine drifted into sleep, still wrapped in her husband's arms. Robert recovered fully, though it took longer than either of them liked. By the time the doctor pronounced him fit to return to work, it was late May, and there was a mountain of tasks that had accumulated. Robert threw himself back into the work with perhaps too much enthusiasm, and Katherine had to remind him more than once that he was not invincible. The summer was busy and prosperous. The cattle thrived on the spring rains, and Robert was able to sell a large portion of the herd at good prices. With the money, he bought more land, expanding the ranch boundaries and increasing the grazing area. He also invested in better stock, purchasing a bull with excellent bloodlines to improve the herd quality. Matthew, now 10 years old, was becoming a real help around the ranch. He could rope and brand, could doctor sick animals, could ride all day without complaint. Robert began teaching him the business side of ranching, explaining about markets and prices, about breeding and genetics. Katherine watched them together, heads bent over the account books in the evening, and felt her heart swell with pride. Sarah, at 8, was less interested in the cattle but had become an excellent rider. She would take her pony out for hours, exploring the ranch boundaries, always returning with new sketches of birds or plants or rock formations. Katherine encouraged her daughter's artistic inclinations, ordering paints and good paper, displaying Sarah's best work on the walls of the house. The twins, now 2, were into everything, tumbling over each other like puppies, always laughing or crying or demanding attention. Katherine sometimes felt exhausted by the sheer energy required to keep up with them, but she would not have traded it for anything. In the fall of 1892, the territorial governor announced plans to push for statehood, and the news created much excitement in Clifton. There were debates and discussions, hopes and fears about what statehood would mean for the territory. Robert was cautiously optimistic, believing that official recognition would bring investment and growth, while some of the older ranchers worried about increased federal interference. Katherine attended the town meetings with Robert, listening to the arguments, forming her own opinions. She had come to love this harsh, beautiful land, had put down roots deeper than she ever could have imagined. The thought of Arizona becoming a state filled her with a fierce pride. That Christmas, the Crawford house was filled with family and friends. The Morrisons came out from town, along with Miss Ellis, the schoolteacher, and Judge Winters, who was now quite elderly but still sharp as a tack. They feasted on roast beef and potatoes, on pies and cakes that Katherine and Clara had been baking for days. The children performed a nativity play that dissolved into giggles halfway through, and Robert led them all in carols around the piano that Katherine had insisted on buying the previous year. As the evening wound down and the guests departed, Katherine and Robert stood on the porch, watching the wagon lights disappear into the darkness. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine. "This is a good life," Robert said, putting his arm around Katherine's waist. "Better than I ever hoped for." "Yes," Katherine agreed, leaning into his warmth. "It is." They went inside together, to the house full of sleeping children and glowing embers, to the life they had built together from nothing but hope and determination and love. The years continued their steady march. Matthew grew tall and strong, taking on more responsibility until he was effectively Robert's partner in running the ranch. Sarah's artwork improved to the point where people in town began commissioning pieces, paying good money for her watercolors and sketches. The twins developed distinct personalities despite their identical appearance. Thomas was thoughtful and serious, while James was bold and prone to pranks. In 1895, Katherine gave birth to their 6th and final child, a daughter they named Emma. She was a tiny baby, smaller than the others had been, and Katherine worried over her constantly those first few months. But Emma proved to be tough, thriving despite her small size, growing into a cheerful child who seemed to find joy in everything. The ranch continued to expand and prosper. Robert was now one of the most successful ranchers in the territory, respected by his peers and trusted by those who did business with him. He never forgot what it was like to struggle, always willing to help a neighbor in need, to extend credit to a young rancher just starting out. His reputation for fairness and generosity spread far beyond Clifton. Katherine had become a force in the community as well, organizing the Ladies' Aid Society, raising money for a new school building, advocating for better roads and mail service. She wrote letters to the territorial legislature, arguing passionately for women's suffrage and other reforms. Some people thought she was too outspoken for a woman, but Katherine no longer cared about such opinions. She had found her voice in this wild country, and she intended to use it. The storms still came, regular as clockwork during the summer months. Katherine's fear had never entirely disappeared, though it had mellowed over the years into something she could almost ignore. But Robert never forgot. Whenever thunder rumbled in the distance, he would find Katherine, would take her hand or put his arm around her shoulders, would offer the silent comfort of his presence. It had become such an ingrained habit that the children noticed and began to do the same thing, gathering around their mother when the sky grew dark, creating a protective circle of love. In the summer of 1898, Matthew announced his intention to marry a young woman named Lucy Morrison, the daughter of the general store owners. Katherine had watched the courtship develop over the past year, had seen the way her serious, hard-working son transformed in Lucy's presence, becoming lighter, happier. The wedding was held in the Clifton church, with half the town in attendance, and Katherine cried tears of joy as she watched her firstborn pledge his life to another person. Matthew and Lucy built a small house on the ranch property, and within a year, Katherine was a grandmother, marveling over a tiny baby girl named Rose. Holding her granddaughter in her arms, Katherine thought about the twisting path that had brought her to this moment, about the frightened young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 16 years ago with nothing but hope and desperation. That woman would scarcely recognize the person Katherine had become, confident, strong, surrounded by family and purpose. The new century arrived with celebration and speculation about what the future might hold. Sarah, now 18, announced that she had been accepted to an art school in San Francisco, and while Katherine felt a pang at the thought of her daughter leaving, she was proud of Sarah's ambition and talent. They sent her off with trunks full of supplies and dresses, with warnings to write often and promises that she would always have a home to come back to. The twins, now 10, were attending school in town and showing academic promise, particularly Thomas, who had a gift for mathematics. James was more interested in the mechanical, taking apart and reassembling anything he could get his hands on. Emma, at 5, was the baby of the family, doted on by everyone, already showing signs of her mother's determination and her father's steady temperament. Through it all, through the daily joys and sorrows, through the small dramas and large milestones, Katherine and Robert remained the center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Their love had deepened and matured, had weathered difficulties and celebrated triumphs, had proven itself constant and true. One evening in the late summer of 1901, when the air was soft with approaching autumn, Katherine and Robert took a rare moment alone, riding out to a high point on the ranch that overlooked the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in glorious shades of pink and gold, and the land stretched out below them, their land, won through hard work and faith. "I have been thinking," Robert said, his hands resting on the saddle horn, his eyes on the vista before them, "about everything that has happened since you arrived on that stagecoach, about how different my life would have been if you had not answered my advertisement." "Different how?" Katherine asked, though she knew the answer. "Empty," Robert said simply. "I would have had the ranch, the success, the material things, but it would have been empty. You brought life to everything, Katherine. You made a house into a home, made success into something worth celebrating, made every day worthwhile." Katherine guided her horse closer to his, until their legs were nearly touching. "You gave me a life worth living," she said. "You gave me a home when I had none, a family when I was alone, love when I thought I would never find it. You held me through every storm, Robert, both the ones outside and the ones inside my head. How can I ever thank you for that? You already have, Robert said. Every day in 1,000 small ways. You are my partner, Katherine, my best friend, my love. Everything I have accomplished, I accomplished with you by my side. They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. A cool breeze picked up, carrying the promise of change, of seasons turning, of time marching inexorably forward. But Katherine felt no fear of the future, only gratitude for the present and the past that had led to it. As they turned their horses back toward home, toward the lights of the ranch house glowing warm in the gathering dusk, Katherine heard the distant rumble of thunder. She glanced at the sky and saw clouds building to the south, backlit by the last rays of the sun. "Storm coming," Robert observed, following her gaze. "Yes," Katherine said, "but we will face it together as we always do." Robert reached over and took her hand, and they rode home side by side, toward their children and grandchild, toward the dinner waiting on the stove and the beds that would be warm against the coming rain. The thunder rumbled closer, and Katherine smiled because she was not afraid. She had Robert, she had her family, she had everything that mattered. The storms could come and go, but this love, this life, this was forever. Years later, when Katherine was in her 70s and Robert was beginning to slow down, when the ranch was being run by Matthew and his sons, when the house was filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren during the holidays, Katherine would sometimes sit on the porch and think about her life. She would think about that frightened young woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, who had been terrified of thunder and uncertain of the future. She would think about all the storms she had weathered, both literal and figurative, and how Robert had been there for every single one, his arms around her, his presence a constant source of strength. Arizona had achieved statehood in 1912, a moment of celebration that had seemed impossible in those early days. The ranch had grown beyond anything Katherine could have imagined, spanning thousands of acres and supporting not just their immediate family, but dozens of employees and their families. The little town of Clifton had grown too, with paved streets and electric lights and all the modern conveniences that Katherine had once taken for granted back in Boston. But what mattered most had not changed. Katherine and Robert still sat together in the evenings, still held hands when thunder rumbled in the distance, still looked at each other with the love that had grown steadily over more than 4 decades of marriage. Their children had built good lives, had given them grandchildren who were now having children of their own. The family tree that had started with a mail-order bride and a lonely rancher had spread and flourished, putting down roots that would last for generations. On a warm afternoon in the spring of 1923, Katherine and Robert sat together on the porch, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. Robert was 81 now, his dark hair long since gone gray, his face deeply lined by years of sun and wind. Katherine was 73, her own hair white, her hands marked by a lifetime of work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been, still felt the same flutter of recognition and love. "Do you remember," Katherine said, "that first storm when you held me on the sofa and I realized I might actually be falling in love with you?" Robert smiled, the expression creating familiar creases in his weathered face. "I remember thinking that I would hold you through every storm for the rest of our lives if you would let me." "And you have," Katherine said, reaching for his hand. "You have kept that promise, Robert Crawford. Through every storm, every difficulty, every moment of fear or doubt, you have been there." "As you have been there for me," Robert said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Katherine. The best decision I ever made was placing that advertisement in the Boston Herald. And the best decision I ever made was answering it, Katherine replied. The storm was closer now, the thunder a deep bass note that rolled across the valley. Katherine felt the old familiar flutter in her chest, the shadow of the fear that had once controlled her. But Robert's hand was warm in hers, solid and real and constant, and the fear had no power anymore. They sat together as the storm broke over the ranch, as rain pounded the roof and lightning illuminated the landscape in stark flashes of white. Robert's arm was around Katherine's shoulders, her head resting against his chest, and they watched the storm together the way they had watched hundreds of storms over the years, finding beauty in the fury, peace in each other's presence. When the storm passed, leaving the air clean and cool, Katherine turned to Robert and kissed him, a gentle brush of lips that still carried the spark of passion that had never quite faded. "I love you," she said. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Robert said. "My brave, beautiful mail-order bride who was scared of thunder. You have made every day of the past 41 years worth living." They went inside as the sun broke through the clouds, creating a rainbow that arched across the valley in brilliant bands of color. The house was warm and filled with the smell of the stew that their housekeeper had left simmering on the stove. Photographs lined the walls, a visual history of their life together. Their wedding day, each of their children as babies, Matthew and Lucy on their wedding day, all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren in various poses and ages. This was what they had built, Katherine thought as she moved through the familiar rooms. This was the legacy of a frightened woman and a lonely man who had taken a chance on each other, who had chosen to face their storms together rather than alone. It was a legacy of love and courage, of hard work and dedication, of a partnership that had proven stronger than any challenge thrown against it. That night, they lay in the bed they had shared for more than 4 decades, Robert's arm around Katherine, her head on his shoulder, fitting together as perfectly as they had that first night they had truly come together as husband and wife. Outside, the last of the storm clouds were clearing, revealing a sky full of stars. "Thank you," Katherine whispered into the darkness, "for everything. For giving me a home, a family, a life beyond anything I could have dreamed." "Thank you," Robert replied, "for taking a chance on a rough cowboy who did not know the first thing about courtship or romance but knew enough to recognize a treasure when he saw one." They drifted into sleep, peaceful and content, secure in the love that had sustained them through every trial, every joy, every storm. And if thunder rumbled again in the night, they would face it together, as they always had, as they always would, for as long as their hearts continued to beat. Because that was what they had promised each other all those years ago, whether they had spoken the words aloud or not. To hold each other through every storm, to be each other's shelter and strength, to love without reservation or limit. It was a promise they had kept every single day of their marriage, and it was a promise that would endure long after they were gone, living on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their love forward into the future. The mail-order bride who had been scared of thunder had found her courage in the arms of a cowboy who had never failed to hold her when she needed it most, and together they had built something that would last forever. A family, a legacy, and a love story for the ages.